From June 6 to the 8th, 2010, representatives from government, academia, the analytical community, the Joint Military Services, and non-governmental organizations gathered at West Point for the U.S. Army's 47th Annual Senior Conference. The conference focused on a new human capital model for the officer corps, one recognizing the interdependency of assessing, retaining, developing, and employing talent.
Well, welcome everyone to this year's senior conference, and thanks to all of you who work so diligently to make this conference a reality.
Tom Lamont is the Assistant Secretary of the Army for Manpower Reserve Affairs. It's one of the senior civilian jobs in the Army.
I'm honored to co-chair the Human Capital Enterprise with General Dempsey.
He is, by law, given the responsibility to supervise the Manpower Reserve Affairs of the United States Army.
I've got a great partner in Mr. Lamont, who is truly a breath of fresh air.
General Dempsey, General Marty Dempsey, is the Commanding General of the United States Army Training and Doctrine Command, which is the part of the Army that thinks about how should the Army be structured, what kind of officers do we need. So between him and Tom Lamont, they are the co-chairs of the Army's Human Capital Enterprise. So together, they're working to find the best way for us to build this Army to make it the best Army in the world.
Talent management, I think, means fundamentally understanding really what the full range of capabilities an officer will bring to bear to a certain situation, understanding what the demands are for particular knowledge, skills, abilities, background, experience, education, and being able to match those two together.
One of the reasons we're here is to read the weak signals. A strong signal says you are in crisis tomorrow and you've got to act. You've just had some tragic event that's triggered an action. Right now, I think we're getting enough weak signals to say that a crisis could be on the horizon, and so that's why we're here. We're here to look at those and to take action right now that is thoughtful and that will make a difference.
I mean, this is one of those issues that probably requires us more to just roll up our sleeves, not try to seek a brilliant answer, but seek an answer that we can gain consensus on and then actually make some changes. And as we begin to, gather our thoughts here and decide what we're going to take forward to the chief, it has to make sense in the coherence of what we are as an Army. And
this is the second of my senior sessions like this. The whole purpose of the conference is to take a break from being right here and having our nose to the grindstone and step back, gather strategic leaders from industry, from academia, from the military, and ask the question, how are we doing?
In some areas where we can make some success.
And I think that's when we're effective as an Army. When you can take people at all different levels of their career, different levels of responsibility, who view problems from different perspectives, bring people from outside the institution to look at it, and then collaborate on developing solutions.
I think the biggest issue for the officer corps right now is the stress and strain it's under because of 9 years of fighting 2 wars. We need to look at it and ask ourselves, do we have the quality of officers, the number of officers, and the right distribution of officers that's necessary for our Army to win the wars we're fighting now and to be ready for the conflicts of the future?
We better ask ourselves, and maybe we'll do some of that this week, some very vital questions. What kind of Army do we want for 2020 or 2030? What kind of Army will we need? What kind of Army can our country afford? Who will be our enemies? What will be their capabilities?
As we go through this week, or this next couple of days, and talk about how to manage the Army's talent, we have to do so in the context of what it means to be a profession. And my personal belief now is, watching what's happened over about the last 9 years, the stresses on our profession, reflecting on the fact that we really haven't studied our profession for about 20 years, if we're honest with ourselves. And it is my firm belief that we're at one of those inflection points in our history where we've got to take a very close look at our profession and what it means and what it must mean to this country, because it's served it well over the course of time, and God help us if we don't continue to make sure it does into the future. Thanks very much.
The first topic for us to understand is basically how we define and think about talent.
The entire human capital model hinges on this idea of talent. If we don't get that right, then our efforts to assess, develop, retain, and employ will be in vain. We conceive talent as the intersection of skills, knowledge, and behaviors. As we're all aware, the Army today faces a wide range of challenges. And the question is, how can the Army as an organization maintain the depth and breadth of talent to not only accomplish the very difficult missions at hand, but also be prepared for any unforeseen challenges that might arise? When we put the right person in the right job with the right team at the right time, that's when we see the productivity and effectiveness of an organization soar.
I think if we could only pick one thing to do well, it would be the people part of the Army. I think everybody agrees. The real issue is, to me, how to do it. You know, how do you really unleash that full human potential of everybody to be the best they can be, to seek their passion, to get their full human potential? The idea of the role of this talent management strategy, I think it's a terrific strategy because it's overarching, it's comprehensive, it addresses the interconnectedness of all the different pieces over the life of the officer. I think we got to get after it, and we are teed up to take this strategy and go to work.
Part of my time I spend working on civilian personnel issues. We have 279,000 civilians who work for the United States Army. And there's a lot of concern about the civilian personnel system, how difficult it is to use it. Well, and the reason for it is the underlying statute was written in the late 1800s. It was written not to fill jobs with talented people. It was written to make sure that you don't hire your brother-in-law. It's all about catching cheaters. It's not about promoting talent. And if we really want to make our civilian personnel system better, we have to go back and challenge the assumptions under which our basic statutes are premised. I think the same thing holds true for talent management in the military. We have to go back. There are things like the underlying ethics of who we are as an institution and what are our values. But at the same time, there are other things that have outlived their usefulness. And we need to be able to discriminate between the two. What do we want to save? But what needs to change? And hopefully what we can get out of the discussion today is a beginning, at least, of looking at what needs to change.
The question is within the human capital model, where does evaluation fit? Does it have a place? And if it does, is our current evaluation system up to the task? When we talk about assess, it has to be able to understand and evaluate those people we're bringing into the Army, find out what skills they have, and do we want these people, and where are we going to put them? Are we going to send them to West Point or ROTC or OCS? When we talk about develop, we want to know how, in what areas does this person need development? We need to evaluate them to see where they need developed, and then after we've developed them, we need to evaluate them again to understand have we actually developed them in these areas that we concentrated on. When we talk about employ, after I've assessed and I've developed somebody, I need an evaluation system that tells me where to employ this person. It tells me about the person, what talents they bring to the table, and about the jobs that we can place them against. And finally, when we talk retain, after I've assessed and I've developed and I've employed somebody, I have to make an evaluation decision on, do I want to keep them around in my organization? Do I have needs for this talent in the future? Or can I let them go or move them somewhere else in the organization?
I do believe we need to take measured change to ensure our officer corps feels connected to our profession and that we don't lose the unbelievable talent that we have today. Number one, we must change the officer evaluation report. I won't tell you what's required, but we'll tell you that now is the time for change.
I think primarily, to add what Rhett just said, that our OER should be adjusted, and possibly NCOER should be adjusted to report on different grade plates, because the skills and knowledge and attributes and values associated with the differences between company grade officers, field grade officers, and general officers are radically different. But I kind of think the current OER system ain't that bad. And I say that it may not promote talent in the best way we want it to, but it gets it pretty darn close. It may be command-centric, but I think that's probably the most important thing we do, is pick commanders to lead soldiers.
It just struck me that one of the things we're struggling with is really the inherent decentralization of the evaluation of officers. And that's a good thing, right? We wouldn't want to try to do this in a centralized way because it's the leaders that are in closest contact with those whom they're developing and who they're engaged in missions with and can observe them, who are best positioned to evaluate them. And the second thing is, to what degree can we compensate for maybe inflation in reports or certain leaders not really being rigorous in their evaluations? Is there a way to sort of put more rigor in evaluation through academic evaluation reports, for example?
The challenge is, in one sense, is objectifying what the evaluation is. And how do we objectify for officers? From the study of professions, let me suggest to you that professions don't promote. That's not in their language, that's not in their culture. Professions certify. It's an objective exam. So we have a wonderful professional education system that, in my judgment, is not as developmental as it could be because it is simply educating. At the end of the education process, that same system, those same institutions, those same faculties could certify. And in just making that one little change, we would be behaving much more like a profession and much less like a bureaucracy. Let me leave you with what I've gleaned over a number of years. Bureaucracies promote, professions certify.
Thanks. I was persuaded that it was time to revise the evaluation system, and in particular the report, long before we came into this session, and I'm even more persuaded by it now. I mean, I think it will be healthy for the institution that as we make some adjustments on the attributes we say are most necessary for the current operating environment, that we have an evaluation report that reflects it. And I'm also persuaded by the idea that one size probably doesn't fit all, and that the attributes that we're assessing at the company level are different than the attributes at the field grade level, and probably for sure different at the general officer level. So I think this is all very positive. And one of the things that's touching on all this is the issue of leadership. And I do think we have not yet appreciated what modularity has done to our ability to accomplish our leadership tasks, notably the requirement to mentor our subordinates. And I think we've, in some ways with our modularity, I think we've disrupted that. Now, we've had to do that. The question is, what can we do now based on the experiences, based on what everybody said are some of the challenges? What can we do to reconnect mentors and proteges, leaders and led, in a way that is potentially disrupted now because of the requirements and the R4 Gen cycle?
Retention's where we stop the bleeding. Sounds daunting. So how do we think about and approach retention with the flexibility to deal with what's to come in the future? I think we start with an eye for talent. And what is it that better talent retention requires? Well, first of all, it implies that we know what talents we have. That's a critical piece. But we also have to understand and appreciate the interdependence of all the other components of our human capital model. When we look at this bathtub, and we call this the bathtub chart, big Army picture, the current set in the Army. Black line is our required strength. Dotted line is our inventory. The first thing we see, and the reason why we call it the bathtub, is the shortage in mid-grade officers. Let's fill the bathtub, in other words.
The clearest indication to me that you have significant problems in an officer corps is when juniors coming in at the bottom, and remember the officer corps is a captured labor market. You don't come in from the side, you start at the bottom. When the juniors, A, don't come in, or when they come in and only stay a short time and leave.
You know, I think the thesis here is that talented officers are leaving the Army at an unacceptably high rate. And my gut is that we can do a better job. I pulled all my junior officers, ex-junior officers aside last week and sort of had a deep think session with them on why did you get out. And the one thing that really struck me was how much it was about recognition, and recognition for the things that they perceived to be their strengths that others didn't perceive. And also, equally, the danger of the bad apple. You know, there's nothing worse than when they see a peer they consider to be inadequate getting promoted along with them, not to mention ahead of them.
This whole talent matching, we do that in business. We do that in my companies. And it's not difficult, but we never get to the point of treating people like interchangeable parts.
To retain quality, talented people, the Army's going to have to make sure that we can accommodate all the aspirations of the talent. We got to be able to answer their questions. Do I like my boss? Do I like my job? Am I making a difference? And if the answer is yes, then we probably just created a positive environment for retaining talent.
General Shinseki used to say, every day we do two things. We train soldiers and we grow leaders. And our junior leaders need to focus on that, and that's a value. That's a compensation in my mind. And we also don't talk about the importance of the leader, the battalion commander. In many of our cases is the reason why many of us who thought we were getting out, as I did, are still around today.
To talk about an officer strategy has to be predicated on an overall strategy for the Army. And it has to be exciting. I know I work a lot with CEOs, and not one of them has ever retained a top talent by saying, my strategy is to maintain the status quo and I'd like you to be part of it. They talk about the strategy and then talk about how it creates an exciting value proposition for that person.
The definition of a positive environment could be all over the board, whether it's job, whether it's location, whether it's your commander. All those things factor into it. But if you don't have that positive environment, particularly if it's a repeated environment that's less than positive, who among us would choose to remain? We won't.
I read a great book called Managing the Unexpected, and what it said is highly reliable organizations are preoccupied with failure. I didn't like that initially because I feel like I'm a glasses half full guy. But what it really was saying is that highly reliable organizations and their leaders are attuned, or mindful is the phrase, of weak signals of impending problems, not strong signals. You know, strong signals will slap you upside the head. You don't have to worry about them. It's the weak signals, and I would suggest to you that there are enough weak signals that we should pay attention to these issues, that's why we're here today. And one other reinforcing point about that. What I really worry about, the young men and women who are in the fight today are deeply committed to it. There is no quit, there's just no quit. They are resolved, they are resilient, they feel like they're doing something very important. When the Army doesn't continue, when the pace is reduced, when we become an Army that is back to being an Army more or less at rest, whenever that happens, whether it's 2 years from now or 10, we better be ready for that group of young leaders, and we better be ready to inspire them, to collaborate with them, to build trust with them, in a way that we haven't had to because the fight has been the raison d'etre. And that gets at this re-emphasis on what it means to be a professional. That's why we're here for this conference. Thanks.
I think about officer session as the mechanism through which the Army can increase talent levels of that force and carry us forward to face new and increasingly complex challenges. Given this set of challenges, how can the Army assess the right people to meet future requirements? Simply stated, the Army should seek talent in places where it has a good chance of finding high talent matches. And it has to do with communicating accurate information to this millennial generation. These are the young men and women who will fill the ranks in the future. They want to leave a mark. They live on the internet. They're technologically savvy. They consume data, play virtual games. I won't make assumptions, but they might be your children or grandchildren or nieces, nephews. You all know them. What message will appeal to this generation, and how is it to be delivered?
We want our officer corps, as well as the rest of the Army, to reflect our society. The diversity in society. And diversity, there's lots of strength in having a diverse organization.
So the first order question for us in accessing talent is, accessing talent for what? To fight and win the nation's wars? I mean, that's what the Army's all about. That's our purpose. Okay. But what's the war going to look like in 2040? What kind of wars are the kids who joined our force 2 weeks ago and in the years ahead, what's that world going to look like? What kind of changes in bioengineering, in biocomputing, in nanotechnology are going to come while these young people are on watch? So why can't we go to Dell or Intel or Google and hire 30 people to be Army officers for 3 years? They're not going to command battalions. They're not going to be leaders of the Army in that sense. But they're going to bring a skill set in specialties that don't even exist yet. Okay, we're going to need them. So how are you going to acquire them and bring them on active duty? So what I suggest to you is, and maybe in this access, retain, develop, and employ model, we take out the 2 middle steps. We access and we employ those particular skills. Maybe it's in the individual ready reserve, however we want to do it with lateral entry, because there are going to be those skills that we need and that we don't have. We did it in World War II. We went around and we designated, you're a colonel, you're a major, you're a captain, you have a skill set that we need. They did it. They loved it. They were proud of it for the rest of their lives.
As we look at this generation, we need to look at how we can craft the message to them to reach not only their key influencers, the parents, but also craft the message to reach them and inspire them as well.
I, too, agree on lateral entries. I do think there are a lot of opportunities out there. And these folks aren't going to end up running the Army. They just aren't going to get there. But there's a need for those people. And I think there are any number of opportunities out there. I'll also suggest, I'm just throwing this out, that maybe we haven't done a good enough job of looking into some of our reserve component at mid-grade levels and saying, hey, you want to come in for a career now? You want to come back in? Or we want to talk about our continuum of service? Is it time for you to come in and fill some of these spots that we need right now? Come in for a year or two. I think it's something we need to really think about and perhaps give a little bit more time and attention to.
I think we've got to be a bit agile in our accessions. You know, there's some enduring qualities we've talked about. You know, physical fitness is one of them, and moral character is another. But then there's some new attributes we have to be alert for, like digital literacy. Mr. Lamont's point at the end there is actually the most important one, though. We have done some things as an Army of necessity. Some of the adjustments we've made in the composition of the officer corps were made of necessity. But they're not part of a strategy because, frankly, we don't have a human capital strategy. And one of the things we're working on is to have a human capital strategy, aspects of which should address the composition of the officer corps, the issue of lateral entry, the qualities that we seek in accession. So to that extent, I think this has been a very valuable session. Thanks to the panel members.
The Army's pretty good at developing talent. So the question is, why are we here to talk about it? And I think the reason is one, it can't be static.
Moderating a discussion on how to improve officer development is challenging, particularly as the Army enjoys a solid reputation in this area. But the Army can't rest on its laurels in a world that changes so quickly. So in this session, my goal was to get participants thinking about how we can be more forward-looking in our talent development efforts. The Army leaders of 2030 and 2040 are entering the pipeline right now, and they won't be equal to the challenges of the future if our talent development methods remain static. The bottom line is strong professions have to continue to innovate in talent development.
You're not a profession just because you call yourself a profession. You're a profession because your client, in this case the people of the United States, consider you a profession. And one of the things a profession does or has is a commitment to education and to development. The problem is, in the context of the current demand, how do we continue our commitment to development? How do we ensure that we're developing our soldiers and our leaders, managing their talents, plural, for the betterment of both themselves and for the institution?
I think that this reoccurring deployment of our officers to combat with limited time in between for development, they're getting a lot of experience, but the educational underpinnings and the development of the core components of the officer corps, I think, are eroding. Some of the skills are eroding, some of the key components of what we've been about as an officer corps are degrading somewhat because of the repetitive assignments to combat. We are a nation at war. We are an Army supporting that nation at war, and that's what's required right now. But now is a very important time to take stock in who we are, where we are, what are we doing, and determining how can we stop some of this erosion.
To be sure, our officer development model needs to be refined. There must be more tailored career paths that lead to promotion. Promotion boards need to recognize that due to an increasing need to specialize, key developmental assignments should be more diverse and more accepted. The current officer development model has become part of our Army culture. We all understand change will be hard, but if we are to remain the most relevant against an increasing array of threats to our nation, we must take on this challenge. Our officer corps and our nation deserves nothing less.
Today's current developmental structure is education, training, and experience. My current assessment is that education is undervalued because training is great if it's the right training, and experience is great if it's the right experience, and combat experience is searing. And what I tell all the majors at the Command and General Staff College is, you really have to concentrate here because if you're not careful, 10 years from now, you'll be known as the Iraq guys who don't get it. Are we really willing to destroy some of our most hallowed policies, procedures, schools to create what we need for the future? Because when you see a lot of these problems here, they're not new. Some of these problems go all the way back to 1983 by the charts. And so you have to ask, why weren't they solved? Maybe it's because we have to destroy some of what we have to create the future. The chance you cannot take is that as you're considering the restructuring of how we develop officers, that you leave out the moral component. Why? Because officership is inherently a moral occupation. What's the Army's plan for moral development? What's the Army's model of moral development? Where is it written? If you read Army doctrine today, it says character development is a responsibility of the individual, period, end of sentence. Now, that says that the institution basically is backing up and saying, whoa, we don't have a big role in this. I would submit you can't afford to do that in the future. You can't afford to miss this.
moral efficacy. How do you accelerate the development of moral agency and moral efficacy? There are models out there about how you do that. People are studying this intensively. It's time to pull that expert knowledge into the Army and to incorporate it in our models of human development.
Everything here that we've spoken about, I think everybody would agree that we value all this. We value education. We value all the broadening experiences. But we're not necessarily rewarding those experiences, rewarding the individuals that take the risk to go out and do those experiences. And the signal to the force is very, very clear. We don't value education because we're picking up officers that have not completed school. So they hear that. The officers that work at the branch hear it, they see it, and then they reinforce it with their populations.
I think the term development in reference to the officer corps as we typically view it across the Army is really, we see it as leadership development. And that's why I think this discussion is very important. Our specialized expertise and training has to be recognized, has to be developed, and has to be encouraged. We can't let it be a constraint on advancement of the officer corps, as was alluded to. And does this require a cultural change? I think maybe it does. Dr. Snyder suggested culture can be very powerful, but it can also be very confining if we're not careful. And I think that's what's incumbent upon us, is to not let our culture be confining for our advancement here.
Couple of things. I really do appreciate Dr. Snyder keeping the fire burning on this issue of the profession and its ethos and the development of character, leaders of character. And we will take that on. I will confess to you that as we try to understand the challenges of leader development in an era of persistent conflict, there's still folks who, without admitting it, will say, it's really not persistent conflict. We just got to wait till we have more time, and then we'll be able to get back to the tried and true developmental models. I mean, I fight that on a daily basis. And my answer to that is, even if we could, we shouldn't, because of all the reasons we suggested here. There are more opportunities for doing things differently, and we really need to be open-minded to doing things differently.
Luck and chance will always play a role in an officer's career, and we can't eliminate that. But we can reduce our reliance on luck and chance if we have an institutionalized, systematic way of employing our officers.
In this discussion session, I wanted to focus the audience on the idea of creating an employment market within the Army, one that inventories and matches our supply of officer talent to the demand for those talents. To do this, of course, we need to know far more about that supply and demand than we do today. So I introduced something called Green Pages, a secure web-based professional network that gathers the information needed to create a true talent market, one that gets the right officer in the right assignment at the right time. Green Pages will give officers a greater voice in their careers, and it will also give commanders the power to build teams in a way that they never have been able to before.
Instead of just having officers assign officers to slots, it's going to be really looking for the right fit. And who doesn't want to be in a job that you're in a right fit?
What we hope will happen, and I think this will, is number one, you're going to probably call that guy senior rater if he's already had a job or two. And you're going to find out what kind of person this is, especially if they put that their number one choice is to come to your unit. And then you're going to open a dialogue, battalion commander to young lieutenant. It's going to be, I think, vibrant and wonderful and say, I see you've got these things. I see you've put us down as your first preference. Let me tell you a little bit about what this unit is doing and when we expect to deploy and all that. And we get into a dialogue. And there, the market is going to take place.
Hey, we're all for this at HRC, just so you all know. We can do great things here. We can really revolutionize how we do this. We've got to do some work in our analytic underpinning, which will make this even more effective. But it's not big money to do some of these things. The technology's out there, we can do it, we can do good things.
I think this has some huge potential. And I'm all about, trying to meet the talent matches and all that. But there's an awful lot of jobs out there that people might not want to sign up for at the given time. I'm just concerned that a lot of those are going to be unfilled. Then we're going to have another talent management problem, because the guy may show his name coming up and matching with a couple things, and then you suddenly say to him, hey, not so fast there, hero, you're going to go someplace else. Well, wait a minute, I've got a perfect match for this job. Yeah, well, so do 15 other people, and you're going to go someplace else. Then I think we're going to generate some emotional baggage in terms of that. And I'm not trying to throw water on this. I'm just very concerned about the requirements for our Army to fill the needs.
I think it's great, and especially if we start looking at the reserve component and the ability to reach out in the reserve component where it may not derail the active duty progression that we're looking at, but be able to reach out into the RC with these specific skills which are void to us right now. So there's potential out there with this if we can get the reserve component into it very quickly.
I just wanted, before I completely leave the green pages, I just wanted to make one brief comment about that. You know, I just think this is going to happen whether we want it to or not, by the way. I mean, this is the future. Social networking, collaboration, trust. It's coming. We just got to deal with it. And I think the concerns really take us to governance, not to whether we should support this or not. It's a more transparent, a more collaborative employment management tool. We're very positive about the young generation. And we really believe that if we enter into this discourse with them and potentially explain why we do the things we do with a little more granularity than we have in the past, that it will actually be quite empowering to the institution and the individual.
I'll turn it back over to our co-chairs for some closing comments. Mr. Lamont.
Thank you. The concept of talent management is truly critical, I think, in the human capital enterprise as we go forward here. Identifying the needs and the requirements of the Army, that'll be somewhat easy, but defining and evaluating and training that talent will be much more of a challenge. Other challenges will be, I think, to adapt and tweak to some extent the Army culture and traditions that we'll have to do so to really identify and take that talent where we need to take it and to retain it for the way ahead. And we're not just looking at the day after tomorrow, but as you know, we're trying to shape the Army for 20 years from now.
We could take a particular policy to our senior leaders and say, we need to adopt this policy. But in the absence of the coherence of what it means to the profession, what it means to our ability, what does it mean to our officer corps? That we've got to have that linkage between a capstone concept that says this is the operating environment we see ourselves in the future, this is how we contribute to the national military instrument of power, this is the way our Army fights, these are the war-fighting functions and the way they contribute together to prevail in that fight, and then, and only then, can we talk about the kind of leaders we have to develop. And then the other thing is, we're going to find a lot of things that we don't want to change, that we simply want to adapt. And then we're going to find some things, I think, that we really should change. And in those places, it won't be enough just to make minor adjustments to a process. That would be akin to putting wings on a caterpillar and calling it a butterfly. We got to watch that too. If there's something that needs to change, then we need to have the moral courage to seek the change in a dramatic way. And then lastly, I really appreciate the fact that there was a thread throughout this conference on the issue of the profession and what it means to be a profession. Because that conversation has got to increase in volume, increase in intensity, and increase in persuasiveness. Because what we're asking these kids to do these days is beginning to strain that a bit. It seems to me that to move a bureaucracy, you have to appeal to it both on the basis of reason. Here's the reason, here's the data, here's the rationale behind why we should change. But that's not enough. You have to appeal on the basis of emotion. Even if the two conflicts ended today, the question we've asked ourselves is, would we just roll back in and just, continue to do things the way we've always done them? The answer is no. The last couple of days was compelling. It was persuasive, actually. I don't think we've grabbed the emotion yet. So what I've got to do now is build that emotional case for change.